Tonight at 10, the human rights lawyer who brought claims of torture and murder against British soldiers has been struck off for dishonesty. Phil Shiner paid thousands of pounds to a fixer in Iraq to drum up false allegations of abuse. Ministers say he's caused years of stress and anxiety.
He's made soldiers' lives a misery over the last few years. I think the decent thing now would be for him to apologise properly.
Dozens of cases brought against British soldiers after the Iraq War will now be reviewed.
It's certainly been very difficult, it's put a lot of stress on my family, and I have had to go through a number of investigations, tribunals, cross-examinations, which of course are all very stressful events.
We'll have detail and reaction, and we'll be asking what happens to the cases already presented. Also tonight, once again, the Bank of England raises its growth forecast. It now thinks the economy will grow by 2% this year. The barrister and evangelical Christian accused of extreme physical abuse after grooming boys in the 1970s. 6 people, including 2 former HBOS bankers, have been jailed for their part in a bribery and fraud scandal. And what happened when Donald Trump, the former Apprentice host, questioned his successor's ratings?
Why don't we switch jobs? You take over TV because you're such an expert in ratings, and I take over your job. And then people can finally sleep comfortably again.
In the South, Winchester College says it deeply regrets the ordeals of victims after allegations of horrific abuse in the 70s. And a recruitment crisis, the GPs forced to work beyond retirement because of a chronic shortage of doctors.
Good evening. Phil Shiner, a human rights lawyer who brought dozens of allegations of murder and torture against British soldiers who'd served in Iraq, has been struck off for dishonesty. Mr. Shiner paid thousands of pounds to a fixer to find Iraqi clients. He'd already admitted acting without integrity, and his firm is no longer in business. The Defence Secretary, Sir Michael Fallon, said Mr. Shiner had brought great pain to soldiers and to their families and should apologise. Our defence correspondent, Jonathan Peel, has been following the case.
Once an award-winning human rights lawyer, tonight Phil Shiner's reputation lies in tatters. He made his name at the expense of the British armies and the taxpayer in legal aid, accusing soldiers of widespread abuse during the war in Iraq.
I don't know whether people were killed, but I think something went wrong. We need to find out who was responsible and who in command knew what on earth was going on here. They were kept naked, they were sexually humiliated.
Today, a tribunal upheld 12 charges of misconduct against him, including 5 charges of acting dishonestly. He was ordered to pay £250,000. He's been struck off and will never work as a lawyer again. The tribunal also heard Shiner paid an Iraqi agent more than £1.5 million to knock on doors, trawling for business. This was the aftermath of the incident that proved his undoing. The Battle of Danny Boy in Iraq in 2004. Colonel James Coote will never forget that day when he and his men put their lives on the line.
It culminated with soldiers in hand-to-hand combat, fixing bayonets and fighting through heavily defended enemy positions.
Acts of bravery, though, were soon followed by allegations that they murdered, mutilated and tortured Iraqis. A 5-year inquiry costing £30 million found those claims were built on lies and without foundation.
The process of going through the last 10 years has put a great deal of stress on my family, particularly who found it difficult to understand why the process was being applied in the way it was, and to my soldiers and their families as well.
What do you want from Phil Shiner now?
I'd simply asked him to apologise to soldiers and families that have been put through the stresses and strains of the last decade.
There is proof of mistreatment by British soldiers. It was Phil Shiner who highlighted the case of Baha Musa, an Iraqi hotel worker battered to death in British custody. But it was just one of the hundreds of allegations he made.
He's made soldiers' lives a misery over the last few years. I think the decent thing now would be for him to apologise properly to all those troops and their families who he falsely accused.
The Prime Minister too has promised to end what she calls an industry of vexatious claims against British troops, though dozens of allegations of historic abuse are still being investigated. But for Phil Shiner, this is the end of his career. A man who once sought the limelight, but who's now gone to ground. Jonathan Beale, BBC News.
Let's talk a little more about this with our correspondent Caroline Hawley. The other cases mentioned there by Jonathan, Caroline, where does this leave them?
Well, I think this dramatically lightens the workload of investigators who've been looking over the years into more than 3,000 claims of abuse. Phil Shiner himself brought over 2,000 claims of abuse against British soldiers. The vast bulk of them have already been dismissed by the Iraq Historic Allegations Team, which is the investigation set up by the government to look into the claims. But what happened today certainly has far-reaching consequences for that investigation and into the remaining cases, because the tribunal heard that not only had Phil Shiner paid an agent to essentially tout for business, but that agent had then paid Iraqis to come forward with claims. So serious doubt has been cast on their credibility. And I understand that any allegations made by Phil Shiner's firm that don't have any corroborating evidence will now be thrown out without further investigation. He's obviously no longer in business to bring any more claims, but I've been told that the investigators will still be left with a number of serious claims. We don't know the exact number, a fraction of the overall number that were brought, but claims that are deemed to be credible and that do need to be properly investigated.
OK, Caroline, again, thanks very much. Caroline Hawley there. Well, the Bank of England has made another significant change to its forecast for economic growth. It now estimates that gross domestic product will rise by 2% this year, significantly higher than its previous prediction of 1.4%. But the bank is warning that there will be further substantial increases in inflation over the coming months. Our economics editor, Kamal Ahmed, has more details.
We're still spending. Employment is rising.
The Bank of England cuts interest rates.
Borrowing has become cheaper. And today, the governor even nodded to the new president and his plans to boost the US economy. All reasons for the significant upgrade of Britain's growth forecast. The governor admitted that consumers had shrugged off any Brexit gloom.
Consumers have not been affected by any of the associated uncertainty around Brexit. And that is, to a large degree, understandable. I mean, the labour market is still holding up. Wages are growing roughly the same rate, modestly, but roughly the same rate as they had in the past. And in part because of our actions, credit is available and it's cheap.
These UK growth upgrades are some of the fastest the bank has ever published. Last November, it said growth for 2017 would languish at 1.4%. That figure has been raised to 2%. For 2018, it originally said growth would be 1.5%. That has also been increased, more modestly, to 1.6%. Mixed in with the good news, some caution. For this small food firm in Kent, inflation is on the up, driven by the fall in the value of sterling. The price of goods Nimisha Raja buys have increased by 25%.
For the moment, we're able to absorb the prices. We're not passing it on to the retailer, and therefore that's not being passed on to the end consumer. When we do need to pass on the price, I don't know whether it's going to reach the end consumer, depending on what the retailer's views are.
And as the pressures build, might the bank have to reach for that cooling button, an interest rate rise?
Is there more of a risk of an interest rate rise than there is of a further interest rate cut?
If we do see a situation where there is faster growth in wages than we anticipate, or that spending doesn't decelerate later in the year, one could anticipate that there would be an adjustment of interest rates, an increase in interest rates. That is not a signal.
Here at the Bank of England, the governor struck a pretty upbeat note today, but there are still warning lights flashing in this inflation report. The amount we are saving has fallen to historic lows, and that could be a problem if the economy does take a turn for the worse. I think the bank here is still nervous. Yes, there is better news, but as the governor said, we have only just started our journey to Brexit.
On growth, it's been a roller coaster ride for the bank, a sharp change in direction to positive. Consumer debts, though, are high and savings are low. That positive news will need to keep flowing if the UK is to keep prospering. Kamal Ahmed, BBC News.
The government has published a white paper setting out more details of its plans for the Brexit negotiations. The Brexit Secretary, David Davis, told MPs that changes would be phased in gradually and that the UK would not find itself on the edge of a cliff. The paper promises a new immigration bill and says that ministers will seek separate deals for key industries to try to retain access to the European single market. Our political correspondent Vicky Young has more details.
Be ambitious, be positive about Britain's future outside the European Union. That's the message from ministers who say they're aiming for a strong new partnership with the EU.
Secretary David Davis.
The man charged with achieving that told the Commons that the referendum was not a vote to turn our back on Europe.
It was a vote of confidence in the UK's ability to succeed in the world and an expression of optimism that our best days are still to come. Whatever the outcome of our negotiations, we seek a more open, outward-looking, confident and fairer UK that works for everyone.
Under pressure to reveal more, the government's published some Brexit plans. Priorities include putting Parliament in control of our laws, making immigration decisions in the UK with a new system that'll be phased in over time, continuing security cooperation with the EU, and establishing the freest possible trading relationship with EU countries. Theresa May's already announced that the UK will leave the single market, but today's document says she'll seek a special arrangement for key industries such as car manufacturers and financial services. MPs are demanding that Parliament is regularly consulted when negotiations get underway.
So there's no point in having a vote after he's already signed it off with the European Union, treating Parliament as some sort of afterthought.
MPs are demanding a say on the deal that Theresa May does with the European Union. They want the power to order her back to Brussels if they think it's not good enough. But before Labour can focus on that fight, they're going to have to get over a few problems of their own.
Is Brexit splitting Labour, Mr Corbyn?
The Labour leader ordered his MPs not to block the Brexit process last night, but dozens disobeyed, some resigning from his shadow cabinet. Jeremy Corbyn couldn't even rely on one of his closest allies, Diane Abbott. She was taken ill shortly after this debate,
So of course the government
and just before the crucial vote, and had to go home. But some colleagues don't believe her.
It is extraordinary that Diane Abbott sneaks off saying that she's ill. You know, people who are well enough at 5 o'clock to be in Parliament are well enough to be there for the vote at 7 o'clock. I think we know what's going on here. She bottled the vote.
Tonight, Malta is preparing to host a summit of all 28 EU leaders. Theresa May's set out her intentions. She'll leave early so everyone else can discuss their Brexit tactics. Vicky Young, BBC News, Westminster.
The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, says he was completely unaware of allegations of extreme violence and physical abuse made against a former colleague who worked at a Christian summer camp for boys in the 1970s and 1980s. BBC News has spoken to the daughter of the man, a barrister called John Smythe, who says her father must face justice if the claims are borne out. Hampshire police are investigating the allegations, as our religious affairs correspondent Martin Bashir explains.
I'm John Smythe.
John Smythe QC, now working in South Africa, is at the centre of allegations involving the abuse of young boys who were allegedly groomed at a series of summer camps in Dorset in the 1970s.
People matter to us very much.
The camps, which still take place every August, involved boys from the top 30 private schools in the country. They'd engage in activities during the day and then hear talks about the Christian faith during the evening. We've spoken to an alleged victim who would not appear on camera, but explained how he says the abuse would happen. He'd be invited to John Smythe's house in Winchester, where he would be asked about his personal prayer life. He was then asked if he masturbated. Upon confession, he would be beaten with a cane. The Ewan Trust, which oversaw the camps, was made aware of what victims say happened in Winchester in 1982, but decided not to inform the police. One of Smythe's closest friends and part of the leadership team defended their decision not to report the abuse.
We discussed telling the police. I wasn't part of that discussion. But the young men themselves didn't want to have their names mentioned. They had suffered enough at John Smythe's hands without wanting to the indignity of describing everything in court.
At the time, the Church of England had no safeguarding policy in place. The Archbishop of Canterbury, who also worked alongside John Smythe as a young leader, says he knew nothing of the alleged abuse until 2013.
I was 19, 20 years old. I was a junior leader in a camp. These were the senior leaders. I wasn't part of the inner circle. The churches should be held to a higher standard than anyone else, and we've failed in that. And that's a terrible, terrible thing.
Late this afternoon, one of Mr. Smythe's daughters gave the BBC an interview in which she said that her father should be made to account for his actions.
I will always love my father. However, if these allegations are true, I do think he will have to face justice, and that will be painful for everyone involved. But I believe strongly in justice, and I would want that for someone who had done that to my child.
We approached Mr. Smythe at his home in Cape Town, South Africa, but he refused to answer our questions. Tonight, Hampshire Police announced they're investigating these allegations of abuse and appealed to victims to come forward. Martin Bashir, BBC News.
A deal to end part of the long-running dispute which has inconvenienced many thousands of passengers on Southern Rail has been reached. The company has been holding extended talks with the ASLEF union to resolve a disagreement about the role of guards on trains, but the RMT union is still involved in a dispute with Southern, as our transport correspondent Richard Westcott reports.
It's the bitter dispute that's been paralysing one of the country's busiest lines. But tonight, Southern Rail's finally reached an agreement with its drivers.
Do you know that the Southern Rail strike, they've come to a deal in the last hour or so? I was just wondering if you...
No, I hadn't heard that, but thank you, that's terrific news.
It's been absolute hell for the last kind of 12 months and has impacted on a lot of things and a lot of people.
The row was over the role of staff on trains. Southern wants drivers, not conductors, closing the doors. The union says that's not safe. Neither side's giving details, but the company's hinting its changes will still go ahead.
Our modernisation plans that we introduced earlier in the year are intact, so we will continue to work the reliability of the service up and improve and get back to the service standards that we've achieved previously.
But ASLEF says it's secured significant concessions on safety and is confident members will vote for the deal.
Well, after the past year and where we've been, we very welcome that we've actually come to a consensus that we've got something to offer our membership that we believe will help deliver a safer railway.
So it took 2 weeks of what I'm told was very intense negotiating inside this building, but Southern Rail does seem to have reached a deal with its drivers and both sides say they're happy. Of course, ASLEF wasn't the only union involved in this dispute, so it doesn't end here. The RMT union isn't part of this deal. It represents conductors and could still announce more strikes, knocking out a third of services each time. So the pain isn't quite over for Southern's long-suffering passengers. Richard Westcott, BBC News.
President Trump has again defended his controversial travel ban on people from 7 mainly Muslim countries and insisted that America was being taken advantage of by every nation in the world. He said he'd had a series of tough phone calls with various world leaders, including a less than diplomatic exchange with the Australian Prime Minister over a deal to bring a group of mostly Muslim refugees to the US. Our North America editor, John Sopel, reports now.
The trappings of office are impressive. The reality is burdensome. Last night, President Trump and daughter Ivanka left the White House to fly to an airbase where the remains of a US Navy SEAL were being returned, killed after a military operation in Yemen, the first one ordered by America's new commander-in-chief. At a prayer breakfast this morning in Washington, that experience seemed to weigh heavy.
Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. we will never forget the men and women who wear the uniform. Believe me.
But overwhelmingly, the tone on foreign policy is abrasive.
When you hear about the tough phone calls I'm having, don't worry about it. Just don't worry about it. They're tough. We have to be tough. It's time we're going to be a little tough, folks. We're taken advantage of by every nation in the world virtually. It's not going to happen anymore.
In the past day or so, we've seen a warning shot fired at Iran.
We are officially putting Iran on notice. Thank you.
Details have emerged of what was apparently a shouting match between him and Australia's Prime Minister. This was over an Obama-era agreement that the US would accept mainly Muslim refugees that Australia wouldn't take. And with Mexico, a warning he'd send troops across the border if the authorities there didn't deal with the bad hombres, as he called them. The person who'll be in charge of US foreign policy from now on, Rex Tillerson, took up his post today. What was striking was how much more conciliatory he was.
No one will tolerate disrespect of anyone. Before we are employees of the State Department, we are human beings first. Let us extend respect to each other, especially when we may disagree.
It's too soon to say what a Donald Trump foreign policy will look like. Yes, we've heard what he's said, but we're yet to see what he'll do. What we do know is that he will continue to take aim at anything or anyone who gets in his way. Even Arnold Schwarzenegger, his successor on The Apprentice.
And I want to just pray for Arnold, if we can, for those ratings, okay?
And it brought a fairly swift response from the former governor and Terminator.
Hey, Donald, I have a great idea. Why don't we switch jobs? You take over TV because you're such an expert in ratings, and I take over your job. And then people can finally sleep comfortably again.
John Sopel, BBC News, Washington.
6 people were sent to prison today for a major fraud. Their crimes, thought to have cost up to £1 billion, destroyed many small businesses run by customers of Halifax Bank of Scotland, now owned by Lloyds Banking Group. The fraud was facilitated by 2 employees of the bank, which for years has refused to acknowledge responsibility for what happened or offer to compensate the victims. Our economics correspondent Andy Verity has uncovered evidence that suggests the bank also misled the police.
4 greedy and devious consultants who bribed 2 dishonest HBOS bankers. In exchange, the bank forced small business customers to pay for the consultants, who plundered the businesses to buy holidays, foreign property and yachts.
This has been the longest and most complex case in Thames Valley Police history. Lyndon Scourfield, who worked at the Halifax Bank of Scotland's office in Reading, struggling small companies would approach him for advice to turn their businesses around. Instead of offering help that he should have done, he lent them more and more of the bank's money. He also referred them to his consultancy friends, David Mills et al., who charged him extortionate fees and stripped them of their assets.
This family of Oxfordshire farmers had a brush with the fraudsters that put them on a path to ruin that they estimate cost them £70 million. But worse than the money was the mental torture of fighting off a powerful bank.
I hope that the bank do the right thing and compensate all the victims, because I think the victims have lived hell on earth for the last 12 years. I know me and my family have.
Former Tory MP Sir James Pace says Lloyds Banking Group, which now owns HBOS, told him there'd been no wrongdoing.
The bank said that they had carried out their own internal investigation and they found, and this is correct, they found no evidence that Mr. Scourfield had benefited from his association. That is a pretty definitive statement that was clearly and utterly wrong. So either their internal investigation was a shambles and failed, or they were lying.
I've uncovered evidence that the bank misled the police. Thames Valley Police got in touch with the bank in March 2008 to ask if accounts managed by Lyndon Scourfield were under any sort of formal investigation. It took 5 weeks for the bank to come back and say, I cannot offer any information that would support or substantiate any allegations of wrongdoing. But we found out that by that point, they'd done at least 3 internal reports into Scourfield's lending. Lloyds told us it couldn't interpret statements made nearly a decade ago because it couldn't know the context. But today, the victims were still waiting for the bank to acknowledge responsibility for its former employees' actions. Andy Verity, BBC News, Southwark Crown Court.
In France, prosecutors are said to have widened their investigation into the financial affairs of François Fillon, the centre-right presidential candidate. He's been under increasing pressure to step down over allegations that he paid his wife a salary as a parliamentary assistant for work that she didn't do. As our correspondent Lucy Williamson reports, Mr Fillon was seen until recently as the favourite to win the presidential election in May.
He's hoping to hear this on election day. But François Fillon staked his campaign on his personal life, family, old-fashioned values, strong Catholic faith. Now the man who wanted to cut 500,000 public jobs is accused of falsely paying his wife £700,000 from public funds. Claims he's called mudslinging, misogyny and an institutional coup d'etat.
C'est pas la justice que l'on cherche.
It's not justice they want, it's to break me. And not just me, it's the right they want to break.
Over the course of a decade, Penelope Fillon was allegedly employed as a parliamentary assistant to both her husband and his successor. Investigators are trying to find evidence that her job actually existed. 2 of Mr Fillon's children were also paid for legal advice, though neither was thought to be fully qualified. In an interview from that time, rebroadcast on French television tonight, Mrs Fillon said she had never had an assistant's role.
You've never been actually his assistant or anything? No.
Mr Fillon was seen as the front runner for the presidency. Now polls are suggesting he's losing support and might even struggle to make it to the second round of the election. That would increase the chances that far-right leader Marine Le Pen could end up in the Élysée Palace. This scandal has played into fears of a rotten political establishment, with some saying that Mr Fillon himself has misjudged the mood.
The core mistake François Fillon made was to fight on the legal ground. He should have fought on the moral ground. We thought that his values were strong, and it appears that they are weak. So who is really François Fillon?
Despite the backing of his party, some of Mr Fillon's colleagues are questioning his position. But replacing him 3 months before polling day will be a gamble too. Mr Fillon won his nomination through an open primary contest, and the runner-up, Alain Juppé, has so far said he won't step in. A week ago, François Fillon was a man tipped for president. Now a politician, no longer fighting for election, but survival. The path to France's top job is already littered with casualties. He may be next. Lucy Williamson, BBC News, Paris.
Now, more than 100 works by black and Asian artists from the 1980s onwards are to go on display in Nottingham as part of a new exhibition highlighting their contribution to British art. One artist featured is Sonia Boyce, whose work explores the representation of race and identity in society. And she's been speaking to our correspondent, Elaine Dunkley.
So this is a work by Mowbray Donker. It's clear that she's making this relationship between not only her, Ghana, but also the UK and that story of colonialism. And actually what Mowbray is doing here is saying, yes, I acknowledge that difficult and challenging history, but I'm here, and I'm here in a very strident way.
It's art born out of racial division, inequality and unrest.
This is a work by Eddie Chambers called Destruction of the National Front. And it's seen as a work that announces black art.
The images are powerful. This piece a response to the appropriation of the British flag by racist ideology. The work of black and Asian artists in the 1980s, raising questions that are still relevant.
People often think of the 80s as being this very turbulent time of a lot of social changes happening. And of course artists were in the midst of all those social changes. Questions around race, around gender, around what constitutes Britishness is part and parcel of what they're grappling with.
Only a handful of artists who are black and Asian have received wide recognition for their work. Why is that?
These artists have come and challenged some of those ideas. It's because the system itself is still trying to get to grips with what is it, how can we come at this work? I don't really want to just say that artists have been the victim of racism, because of course they have formed strategies to combat, to challenge, to not just be the receivers of a particular kind of opinion, but to actually make something out of that situation.
Sonia Boyce's work confronts uncomfortable themes, but she's also interested in what is hidden.
It's a 3-year research project that's based at University of the Arts London.
She's currently leading an ambitious project, trawling through British public collections, cataloguing diverse work.
So there's this massive untold story about the ways in which African and Asian artists have historically impacted British art and British culture. And it's never been done before, to be able to chart where works are so that future researchers can go and find those works.
So, an archive which could prove to be an important work of art. Elaine Dunkley, BBC News.
And the usual reminder that Newsnight is coming up on BBC Two. Here's Evan.
We've had more detail about our government's plans for Brexit today, but it's not just going to be up to us. So we'll get a view from the continent as to how messy they over there think the divorce will be. Join me now on BBC Two.
That's Newsnight with Evan here on BBC One. It's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.